I had this really simplistic idea that I would just figure out a way to objectively measure emotion. It should be really straightforward. I mean, everybody knows that there are facial expressions that are universal for emotion. There are physical patterns in the body and so on and so forth. So I thought, well, this will be really easy. I'll just figure out how to measure these emotions objectively, and then I'll get back to what I really am interested in. And what I discovered was that things are always more complicated than they seem, and that certain claims had been made for a really long time about the universality of particular patterns of emotional expression that didn't really bear out the data. Before jumping into the data, I want to advance my slide there. Before jumping in, I'll just say that I am one person standing up here, but really I'm sort of the front man for a larger community of scientists who've been working on this problem, including this is the present configuration of my lab. And I just want to point out Dr. Karen Quigley, who is the co-director of the lab with me. This is our current configuration of our laboratory, but actually the work that I'm going to be presenting over the next couple of days spans 30 years of this lab. So a lot of people have been involved in collecting and the data and writing the papers, and all of the intellectual work that I'm going to show you is really in collaboration with a larger group of really brilliant people. So it's not that surprising that we used to believe things in science that we no longer believe with technological advance, right? We used to believe that the sun revolved around the earth. We used to believe that the earth was flat. These beliefs were rooted in people's everyday experiences, and then they were eventually put to the test by scientific advances and replaced. And the same is true for the science of emotion. That most of the knowledge that you find, or I would say knowledge claims that you find in textbooks and many papers about emotion, actually also began with common sense that I think we could claim at this point have been vanquished by technological advances. And so we're going to consider this in three parts. And we're going to really look at evidence from faces and bodies and brains to help us consider how to build a more viable theory of emotion. And this theory will ultimately take us to a theory of the mind that has its underpinnings in neuroscience, in evolutionary biology, and in philosophy. So here's a general map of the current theories of emotion. And what you see along the x-axis here is the extent to which features of an emotional event or an instance of emotion are enduring, or I should say a category of emotion are enduring versus variable. And along the y-axis is depicted the enduringness versus variability of deep features of emotion, features that we have to infer that we can't observe. And the colors here represent the types of categories that are being proposed. So approaches in the red area are proposing that emotion categories are natural kinds in a classical sense, in the classic sense of a natural kind. And here I've separated basic emotion views, for those of you who are familiar with this literature, that's based on animal work, like Jaak Panksepp's work, versus the basic emotion views that are based on humans, like Paul Ekman's work. In the yellow area are theories that propose emotion categories to be more like prototypes. That is where there might be variability in the instances of the category. So not every instance of anger looks the same, but there's a single prototype of typical features that define the category. And that even though there's variation in the instances, there's kind of a family resemblance to that prototype. And then in the green area are theories that hypothesize that emotion categories are really ad hoc categories where there's a lot of variability, both in the way that emotions manifest and also in the deep features that are considered to be causal. And if you draw a line basically here, everything below the line, they're assuming that emotions are natural kinds. Emotion categories are natural kinds by any definition, either by the classic definition of a natural kind or by a homeostatic property cluster notion, the Boyd definition of a natural kind. And since many of you are philosophers, I'm assuming I don't have to define this for you, but I'm happy to talk about this. I'm happy to answer questions about this in the question and answer period. And so this is what we're really going to test by looking at a summary of evidence that I've put together, starting with the claim that emotions are displayed on the face with expressions that we recognize. This is the first common sense belief about emotions. The idea is that people are supposed to smile in happiness, they're supposed to frown in sadness, they're supposed to scowl in anger, and everyone around the world is supposed to recognize smiles and frowns and scowls as expressions of those particular emotions. And so to begin, I'll just say, consider this evidence. These are the facial movements that are assumed to be universal for which categories? You guys can say it with me because we all know, right? So what's the first one? It's supposed to be an expression of happiness, right? And the second? Anger. Third? Fear. Surprise. Disgust. Right. Good job. Okay. So
it's true.
So it's true and it's common sense. Yeah. So here are the results from a study that coded the facial movements of 7 to 9-year-olds while they were interacting with their mothers discussing various topics. This was done in Linda Camrus's lab, who studies emotional expressions in infants and babies. And what they did was, after they took the videos, they showed the videos to the children, and the children reported how they felt at various times during the interaction. And this was how frequently the children made these facial movements during episodes of the corresponding emotions category. So when children reported experiencing sad, they pouted 11% of the time, which means that 89% of the time they were doing something else with their face that was very meaningful about sadness. Now, this is just a single study, but now what I'm going to show you is a meta-analysis of many, many, many studies in adults that find the same pattern. So along the x-axis here are the proposed universal expressions. The y-axis represents the average proportion of times that people make these facial movements during actual emotional events. This is a meta-analysis. So if you take scowling and anger, when people are angry, they scowl about 35% of the time, which is greater than chance, and it will get you a publication in a really good journal. But what it means is that when people are angry across these studies, they are expressing anger in some other way 65% of the time. So think about you. How do you express anger? Do you scowl like give that sort of full-blown scowl? When is the last time you ever saw someone win? I don't know what the awards are here, but an Academy Award for scowling and anger. People don't win Academy Awards or BAFTAs or anything they don't win awards for scowling and anger, right? When I'm angry, I think, well, sometimes I widen my eyes and just gasp, and sometimes I frown, sometimes I cry, sometimes I laugh in anger, sometimes I sit silently and plot the demise of my enemy in anger. And even more importantly, these are the false positives. This is the proportion of time, for example, that people scowl when they're not angry, or the proportion of time that people widen their eyes, let's say, and gasp when they're not fearful. So 50% of the time when people are scowling, they're not angry. That's That means if you use scowling as the indicator for anger, you would be wrong 50% of the time. Right, 50% of the time. And that's the best, that's the actually has the lowest false positive rate of all of the so-called universal expressions. Now, there are hundreds of studies where test participants are shown those posed photographs of faces of scowling and smiling and so on. And the subjects are asked to select the emotion being portrayed from a small set of emotion words that usually derive solely from English. So when they're used with other people in other cultures, they will use translations of English words. So look at the discrepancies between what people believe in the blue bars and what people actually do in the white bars. Now, these perception studies were largely conducted on people in large urban cultures, in large urban cultural settings, where most people have routine exposure to Western practices and norms. So even in studies that were collected in, data were collected in China or Japan or Korea. So let's look at what happens when we consider how people perceive emotion in small scale remote cultures, because it's widely agreed that the strongest test of universal emotions requires studying people in small scale cultures, small scale societies that are a little more isolated from Western cultural practices and norms. For 40 years, claims of universality were based on basically 3 samples that were taken from one part of the world in Papua New Guinea. And these were reported in just 2 peer-reviewed journals. So for many, many, many years, this is what the claims of universality were based on. Since 2008, there's been renewed interest in this question, using a wider range of empirical methods on a greater number of studies in small scale cultures, so sampling many more cultures. And the majority of studies find substantial variation in emotion perception across cultures. And so these are the ones in red. And I can tell you that in our lab, we went to Namibia to study people of the Himba culture, very, very close to the Angola border. And we also went to Tanzania to study the Hadza, hunter-gatherers, and didn't find anything that even remotely looked like universal expressions. Except in one study, which I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to present here, but I'll just say that most of the original studies and the studies that are basically every study that you would see listed in green uses a particular method to test for universality. So in one study, we took that method and we took 6 emotion categories that don't exist in English, that don't exist in Hazane, that don't exist in China and in Chinese, and but they exist in other cultures. Nobody's ever claimed that they're universal. We made up expressions for them. We popped them into that method, and 5 of the 6 came out looking universal. And it was a different 5 in with the Hadza than it was in China or in the US. And typically we would think that that really what's happening there is that the method is it's kind of concocting the data for universality, but actually I think that when you look at the method, and we're going to talk a little more about that, when you look at the method, it's very instructive about what's happening. What's happening is that there's some aspects of the method that are actually teaching people how to map an emotion concept to a set of facial movements in the experiment. And so the method itself is super instructive for understanding how people learn emotion concepts and categories, and how they use them. So these and other studies were summarized in this paper that I published with 4 of my colleagues a number of years ago. And I'll just sum up, we the 5 of us all came together having very different prior about the question of universal emotions. We spent 2.5 years reading more than 1,000 papers. We met on Zoom. This was pre-COVID. So we were pioneers. And I'll just sum up what we found using some examples. So if you take a look at this person, how does she feel? How do you think she feels? Tired? You know, so you're not allowed. Yeah.
I haven't seen it.
Oh, really?
No.
You think she looks happy?
I'm getting the punchline. Sorry. Shut up.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll just tell you that
I'm predicting.
many times I've given this talk, and people usually see her as looking tired or sad or grieving. Actually, this is my daughter Sophia at the Chocolate Museum in Cologne. And I can tell you that when she's on her 2nd chocolate drink here. What she's experiencing is a profound sense of pleasure. And I have to also tell you, this was not posed, right? I mean, she was just really enjoying herself, and I was taking photographs and sending them back to her dad. And then I looked at that and I thought, wait a minute, that's a really great example. Now, this little sweetie is also experiencing a profound moment of pleasure. And the lesson here is that people move their faces in many ways during instances of the same emotion category. Now, when we just view the eyebrow region of this little guy, it looks like it's part of a scowl in anger. And in fact, people often see this face as angry. And this is, in the United States, a very famous photograph. This is a guy who was assumed, if this photograph was in all the newspapers, and it was assumed that he was furious. This is actually Jim Webb, who in 2006 won the senatorial race in the state of Virginia and returned the US Senate to Democratic control with his victory. So I have to be careful where I show this picture, like when I'm talking in Iowa, for example. But he's not angry. He is pumped. He is really excited, as were many people when he won that senatorial race. Without context, we see his face as communicating anger because, in fact, this face symbolizes anger in our culture. Now, normally when I give this talk, I show an anger face from the movie Inside Out, because it's actually almost a perfect match. But the Disney Corporation doesn't like using their little characters. So this I actually just typed into one of the emotion chatbot, like chat AI things. What do you call them? Emotion AI things, and I put in person who's person who's expressing anger, and this is what I got. So people not only move their faces in different ways during instances of the same emotion category, they also move their faces in the same way during instances of different emotion categories. And just to make this point, I saw this face on Twitter or X about a year ago. Someone had fed it to an emotion AI program, which determined with a very high degree of confidence that this guy was angry. So here is the actual, whoops, what happened? Oh my gosh, wait. No, I need to show you this video because it's so perfect. And then, let's see. There we go. Okay, so when it comes to emotion, a face does not speak for itself. Variation is the norm. A single physical movement, like the curl of a lip or the tilt of a head or the raise of an eyebrow, takes on very different emotional meanings in different contexts. And so where did these expressions come from, actually? Well, it turns out that they were not discovered by observing people express emotions in everyday life. They were stipulated by a handful of scientists and adopted as a universal truth. And then people built a science of emotion around them. But basically what they are is Western stereotypes. Now, how many of you have heard or read that Charles Darwin, oops, it's really, sorry, this is, it happens when you, all right, let's try that again. How many of you have heard or read that Charles Darwin discovered these emotional expressions, that he discovered that they evolved by natural selection as adaptations? Yeah. Well, it turns out that Darwin, first of all, Darwin actually said that they evolved, but they were not, but not by natural selection, actually by Lamarckian evolution. So he didn't mention, I think he mentions natural selection in the expression of the emotions of man and animals once, or maybe twice. But really what he's saying is that these are archaic forms, kind of like your tailbone. They are of no use, and how this is, he used this as evidence for natural selection, for evolution more generally in humans from it. So after publishing The Descent of Man. So basically what Darwin was claiming was that these expressions are ancestral forms that are not useful at all. They're basically like your tailbone. They're not useful, but they're just evidence that we evolved from an earlier form of an animal creature. Now, the point here is not to show you that Darwin was wrong, but that what he wrote in this particular book has a particular historical context, and it really should be read that way. So, On the Origin of Species was published first. 10 years later, The Descent of Man. On the Origin of Species was widely accepted as a tour de force. Darwin didn't really talk about the evolution of humans in that book. He's mostly talking about other animals. And in The Descent of Man, he then applies the same ideas to humans. And that, my friends, caused a shitstorm. And this book was actually the last chapter originally in that manuscript and was published separately as evidence for his views. And many of the real conceptual innovations that you see in On the Origin of Species are not in the expression of the emotion in men and animals. He basically reverses himself in some ways. So my point here is that in psychology and in neuroscience, there's a tendency to read Darwin and to cite Darwin as if it's a modern text. We don't actually know what Darwin would have said if he had the benefit of knowing all the things that we now know, that we've discovered, right? And so when we're reading those texts, we really should be thinking about them and reading them in a historical context. And that's really true for all of us, right? For all of us. I've written things 20 years ago that I no longer think are accurate based on 20 additional years of collecting data. And so it's really important to read and cite in historical context. Okay, here's the second view, that there are dedicated patterns of autonomic nervous system activity in the body, and that there's one for each emotion category. This is the second common sense belief. So each emotion category supposedly has a dedicated pattern of bodily change that's universal. So in the study of sadness, for example, a scientist might measure changes in the autonomic nervous system, like heart rate or cardiac output, which is the volume of blood being pumped from the heart with each pump, or total peripheral resistance, which is the amount of vascular dilation in your blood vessels, and so on and so forth. So the measures of autonomic nervous system activity are on the y-axis, and the x-axis lists changes in physiological signals relative to some resting baseline. So 0 here means no change from baseline. So we might observe a pattern like this, with an increase in heart rate and an increase in blood pressure, and so on and so forth. And in a given study, we might assume that this is the autonomic nervous system pattern for sadness. But my lab summarized hundreds of studies in over 20,000 subjects. And what we can see is there are actually tremendous variations, meta-analytically, there are tremendous variations in sadness. So the size of the ball there in yellow is the number of effect sizes that were available for meta-analysis for summary, and the size of the wings is a 95% confidence interval. And what you can see is that actually for every emotion category ever studied, there's wide overlap. There's really no specificity here. It doesn't matter whether we do univariate measurements or whether we do multivariate measurements. It doesn't matter whether we use standard analyses or whether we use machine learning. There's tremendous variability in the autonomic nervous system changes within an emotion category, and a lot of similarity across categories. Now, that doesn't mean that all this variation is random. It's very structured. And it is structured by the physical changes in action. So many years ago, the physiologist Paul Obrist observed that autonomic nervous system changes are linked to actions or to the preparation for action. So people do many things when they're happy, for example. So the physiological patterns will also vary because the physiological patterns are tied to skeletal motor movements. So physiological changes are linked to actions, and actions vary within an emotion category, and they also might be similar across categories. Not only do we see different physiological patterns in the same instances of the same emotion category, but the same pattern can be observed in instances of different emotions and even in non-emotional events. And so I just want to give you, this is an example that any of you can go and listen to. This is my friend Jim Cohn. He's a physiologist and a neuroscientist, and he has a podcast called The Circle of Willis. And when he launched this podcast, he asked, can I interview you about your book? And I was like, yeah, sure, you can interview me. And so we had this really fun interview, which you can hear on his, I thought it was fun. I think he had fun too. And then a couple of years later, he had this event happen where he was feeling a lot of, he had difficulty breathing, and he was feeling really worked up. And to him, he was experiencing anxiety. He thought, I'm feeling really anxious, but his chest was tight. He was having trouble breathing. So he went to the cardiologist. Cardiologist did a complete workup, said, no, you're fine. This is just, you're having anxiety. So go home, right? This is a really classic thing that happens. It often happens more to women than to men, research shows. The kind of tightness in your chest that might be happening at the beginning of a heart attack is the same kind of tightness in your chest, the same feeling, the same set of sensations as when you're having an anxiety attack. So a week goes by, he's still having really a lot of tightness in his chest. He's having a lot of trouble breathing. He's really feeling miserable, like really unpleasant, uncomfortable. And he lies down, his wife says, you should go to the emergency room. And he says, I'm not gonna go to the emergency room because they're just gonna tell me that I'm having anxiety. I'm gonna be really embarrassed. I'm not going. And he lies down and he starting to drift to sleep. And then this is his words, right? He tells it much better on his podcast. And then I heard, he said to me, then I heard your voice in my head. And what he heard was he remembered me telling him about the fact that there are these studies which show that more women than men over the age of 65 die of heart attacks, because this is in the US, because they go to emergency rooms and they the emergency room does a full cardiovascular workup, can't find anything, sends the women home, and then they die from heart attacks. And this actually happened to 3 women, 3 people I know whose mothers died this way, which is just a coincidence. It's not like this is not how I discovered this phenomenon. And so he drags himself out of bed. He goes to the emergency room. The emergency room doctor does a full workup. They can't find anything. And they go to send him home. But he's really uncomfortable. And he's really in a lot of discomfort. And he just says, I want you to just get the cardiologist. I want to see the cardiologist. So he sits and he waits. The cardiologist comes, and as the cardiologist is walking through the door, he has a massive coronary, which physicians call the widowmaker for obvious reasons, right? They actually perform an intervention on him without anesthesia because that's how urgent it was for them, and they saved his life. And I learned about all of this when I got an email from him thanking me for telling him about this phenomenon. And of course, I didn't even know that he'd been in the hospital. As I'm going to talk about over the next couple of days, the sense data that we get from the body is a set of outcomes. But the brain doesn't have access to the causes of those outcomes. It just has access to those signals, and it has to figure out what those signals mean. So it's not that you mistake one set of signals for another. It's not like you mistake the tightness in your chest from a heart attack for the tightness in your chest for anxiety. It's that your brain doesn't know what the tightness in your chest is from. It has to make a guess. And so the point is that not only is it the case that there are variable patterns of physiological change with instances of the same category, or the same change can correspond to instances of many different phenomena, including but not exclusive to emotion. Your brain is basically guessing all the time about what those patterns mean. And so some of you may have read that William James, actually observed that each emotion has a distinct bodily state. And in fact, he did. But not in the way that the story is usually told. What William James was saying in the Principles of Psychology is that every instance of emotion has a distinct pattern, right? It's not every type of emotion. So James writes, the fear of getting wet is not the same as the fear as the fear of a bear. Or surely there's no definite affectation of anger in an entative sense. James is basically, when he uses the word emotion, he's referring to instances of emotion. And so he's not referring to types. What's really interesting about this to me is that for basically 100 years, people have been reading William James, or they've been citing William James, is more probably accurate, as if he were referring to types of emotion, categories of emotion. He's referring to instances of emotion. How many of you have heard of the James Lange theory? James Lange theory is a Frankenstein version of William James was talking about instances of emotion. Carl Lange was talking about types of emotion. Basically, people have been citing William James for the past 100 years as saying the exact opposite of what he actually said. So the lesson here is to read the original works yourself. You should never, ever, I know, we all listen. Every single one of us has cited something from a secondary source. I'm just telling you, don't do it. I can tell you some horror stories. Young people, don't do it. Older people, don't do it. Don't do it. It turns out that William James had some really fascinating things to say that have been kind of lost to antiquity, I guess. It's been lost because people are citing each other, citing secondary sources rather than going back to the original work. So what happens when you actually set up your experiments to discover and map the variation that James is referring to? And so I'm just going to tell you about one study where we did that. So what we did is we sent people out into their everyday lives measuring peripheral physiology while they move around. So we hooked them up with a bunch of machines. This is my former graduate student, Erica Siegel, who helped with this study. She now works for Fitbit, making algorithms for Fitbit at Google. Each day, participants were outfitted with sensors and portable equipment to capture their electrocardiogram and their impedance cardiography, the vascular resistance, as well as their posture and their movement for an admirable 8 hours a day for 14 days. Their own physiology was used as the sampling, as the trigger for sampling. And so basically what we did was we assessed every subject's heart rate. Actually, we use interbeat interval, which is the inverse of heart rate, but for the sake of argument, we'll just call it heart rate. And we measured them at a sitting baseline, a lying baseline, a standing baseline. So we knew what their baselines were. And whenever their heart rate changed some proportion over their baseline, but up or down, and they weren't physically moving, that meant there was a state change in the brain that caused that heart rate change. And we knew that some psychological event had shifted. And so that triggered experience sampling. And in those moments, we prompted participants on their phone, asking them to report on their current experience. So we asked them to rate how pleasant or unpleasant they were feeling. And then we asked them to freely label to provide us with emotion labels for what emotions they were feeling, if any, and the intensity of that experience. And so this would allow us to inductively learn which mental features corresponded to which physiological patterns for each subject and whether we could generalize across subjects. So let's first look at all the participants. So we identified 66 clusters of physiological patterns. So we used unsupervised machine learning on each subject's data separately. So we ran a model, we learned a model for each person's data, physiological data. And across people, we identified 66 reliable clusters of physiological features corresponding to physiological change. 44 were observed, if these patterns could be observed in at least 2 people. 22, so a third of the patterns were unique to a person. And there was no pattern that was found in everybody's data. Tremendous variation that is structured and reliable in those data. So, so 8 people had 3 patterns, 3 physiological motifs that we could reliably identify in their data. 12 people had 4 patterns, 14 people had 5 patterns, and so on and so forth. So people varied in the number of patterns that they had. So you can imagine what would happen if we just aggregated across all those data, just like people typically do. You would lose all of that structure. It would be not available to you anymore. Then we looked at the corresponding emotion labels for the 10 most reliable physiological patterns, which here I've labeled on the, I've just listed them on the x-axis. So there were the 10 most frequent physiological motifs or patterns that we identified across subjects. And on the y-axis here, I've listed the emotion words, or the words, basically mental state words, that people nominated. The terms that have a pleasant, or that were rated, that went along with pleasant affect, are in red, and the ones that went along with unpleasant affect are in blue. And what you can see is that for a given pattern, there were many different, corresponded with many different mental features, and the size of the ball is just the frequency with which people use that word. And a given mental feature was associated with more than one pattern. Now, this is across subjects, but actually when you look at the data from an individual subject, this is what you see. You see many to many mappings. This is proof of concept. Now, this study isn't complete in the sense that, so we've demonstrated that there's tremendous variability in people's physiological patterns. We've documented that those patterns are reliable. We've shown that they map in a many to many pattern with different emotion words, the reports of emotional experience. But we're only using, I think, about 8 physiological features. There are many, many, many other physical signals that we could be using to try to find patterns in people and maybe even distinguish different categories of emotion. My point is that this study, we had to invent a technique, a sampling technique. It took me 10 years to get the funding to do this study. And we only ran 51 subjects, and it took 2.5 years to do it. Because we're really set up as a science to look for types. And the belief in types is so strong. The belief in universal patterns still is so strong, even though there's not a lot of evidence for them, that it requires Herculean efforts, basically, to convince someone to give you the money to actually test whether those assumptions are indeed justified. Variation is the norm all the way down, all the way down. So here what I'm showing you is the physiological motifs that we captured are really their end measurements, like heart rate, for example. The innervation of the heart, the autonomic innervation of the heart is complex because the heart receives both parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation. So you can have an increase in heart rate because sympathetic activity goes up. You can have an increase in heart rate because parasympathetic activity goes down, or some combination of the two. And most of the, or I would say about half of the motifs, we saw the reciprocal activation patterns in the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So when one goes up, the other goes down, right? That's the way that most people assume that the 2 branches of the autonomic nervous system are working. But in fact, there were many patterns that didn't show that innervation pattern. So when sympathetic nervous system activity goes up and parasympathetic nervous system activity either goes up or stays the same, your sympathetic nervous system basically has to work harder to get the heart rate up to provide the oxygen and glucose and whatever that the brain is instructing it to do. And so this is a really important finding because it indicates that this exact same pattern of end measurements, an increase in heart rate, a change in blood pressure, increase in blood pressure, so on, can actually be manifest under the hood as multiple patterns of nervous system activity, some of which are much more efficient, metabolically speaking, and much require much less wear and tear on the physiology of the body than others. So, and I'll just say one other thing about this because I think it's really important. We also, this is really in the section on, the body, and so I'm not going to present the full results of this study, but we did do a brain imaging study where we looked at the neural correlates, the bold activation correlates of typical and atypical instances of emotion categories that were, so for example, the typical, a typical instance of fear feels arousing and also unpleasant, but a typical instance of happiness is pleasant. A typical instance of sadness feels unpleasant and is lower in arousal, but there are atypical instances that people have experienced. And so we examined the neural correlates of these, or the correlates in bold signal in an fMRI study, and found a set of really interesting results that I'm happy to talk to you about later, involving the default mode network and the salience network, which are intrinsic brain networks that a lot of people talk about. So findings like this have really changed how we understand the affective circumplex, for example, particularly when it's used with ratings from people who are, asked to rate, say, emotion words, or they're asked to rate emotion concepts, or you give them a set of faces and you ask them to rate those faces. Or you might ask them to rate how they feel at one instance in time in general. What they're giving you essentially is a stereotype of what they believe anger to be. So, the stereotype of anger is that it's high in arousal and unpleasant. But in the literature, there are many, many, many instances of people experiencing pleasure in anger. And so this has really changed how we think about affect, actually, not as an inherent property of emotion, but as a property of consciousness. And I'm going to talk about this more in lecture 3, that we really, really think about affect as kind of a summary, if you will, of the interoceptive state of the body, the sensory state of the body. Your brain is always regulating your body is always sending signals back to your brain. So we think about affect really as properties of consciousness, not properties of emotion specifically. So your brain makes physiological changes meaningful as an instance of emotion. So when you feel a dull ache in your chest or in your belly, your brain is making sense of that, often but not exclusively, as an instance of emotion. And I hope you're catching what I'm doing here along the way, right? I've stopped referring to emotions and I'm trying to make a distinction between an instance of emotion and a category of emotion. Because if you just refer to emotion, as long as you're assuming that emotions are natural kinds, I can talk about anger and it doesn't matter whether I'm talking about an instance of anger or the category of anger, because if it's a natural kind, there's enough regularity in the features that you can make an inference about the entire category based on a single instance. But if emotion categories are highly variable, you can't do that. And so one of the changes that you might see in my writing and the people who I work with is we no longer will just talk about emotion. We'll talk about instances of emotion or categories of emotion, because they're really, an instance only stands in for a category when you have the kind of regularity that you would see in a natural kind category. So the third piece of common sense that we'll consider briefly is the brain basis of emotion. The brain it's assumed to have dedicated emotion circuits.
Let me only make one remark. This is a test alarm.
Okay.
Maybe more mobiles can go on.
Okay.
And we may wait 30 seconds. And everyone closes his mobile. It's the general test alarm in Germany at 11 o'clock. So it's 11 o'clock.
Sometimes I feel like disappointed that all cell phones don't go off.
I want to. Okay. I think almost all phones have a hack. Everyone make sure. Yeah. Downgrade the phone. Is there?
Okay.
Okay. Everyone can take out his phone if someone is, some phone is coming up, then you have it and calm it down, then we are
Great.
ready to go.
Okay.
Sorry for the.
No worries. I just have to tell you, this is, my flight,
the audience up. So.
my flight was canceled, trying to get here. My shower flooded my hotel room this morning. I'm in a towel with my hair, you know, and this big 6'5" guy comes with tools at 6:30 in the morning. I'm like, I have to get dressed. He's like, no. And he goes into the bathroom. Right. Then we got the thing with so. This is gonna make an excellent party story. Excellent. Okay. So. Yeah, okay.
Please take out your phone in your hand and calm it down immediately. Thank you.
So we feel like emotions just happen to us, like they hijack our behavior, making us do and say things we'd rather not. And I think this makes us believe that emotions are pre-wired into our brains at birth, like some inner beast, you know, deep inside our animal brain. But you know, so far what we've I've been showing you is that actually real? Actually,
Just put it on the side.
yeah, but I had it on silent. Now we know we're safe. Override the silencer. Okay, I just have to tell you this one thing. I know. Okay, I'm sorry, but it's just reminds me of this. So I really hate it when people use cell phones when I'm giving a lecture, like to undergraduates, you know. So I forced them to turn their cell phones off, and I said, okay, so if the cell phone goes off at any time during our lecture, what kind of punishment do you want to have? And I let the class decide what the punishment would be. And they decided that if your cell phone goes off in class, you have to stand up and sing a song from a Disney movie in front of the whole class, right? Okay. And so the whole semester, only one cell phone went off once. And whose was it? Because I had a 3-year-old at the time, and I never turned my phone off, right? Never turned my phone off. And so, but luckily, because I had a 3-year-old, I was very well versed. And so it was the Little Mermaid, in case you're wondering. The Ariel song. Okay. So your experiences of emotion don't reveal your brain's inner workings anymore than they reveal how faces express emotion or how bodies manifest emotion. And I'm just going to show you, in the interest of time, because we're running late, just a couple of examples. So here's an amygdala that I've outlined in red. My lab statistically summarized hundreds of studies in which people were experiencing emotion while having their brain scanned to test if the amygdala contains the circuitry for fear, because that's been a long time claim. And so along the horizontal axis is the proportion of studies that report an increase in amygdala activity. And sure enough, you know, about 30% of in about 30% of the experiments where people were experiencing fear, you see an increase in bold signal in the amygdala, which is greater than chance, but actually far too low to be containing the neural circuitry for fear. Also, amygdala activity was not specific to fear. It was observed in studies of a variety of other emotions and even plenty of non-emotional events. So for example, if I just stick your head in a brain scanner and I show you a bunch of images that are completely neutral, that you've never seen before, they're just novel to you, we'll get a whopping amygdala signal which we've observed many, many, many times. So this kind of pattern here is, this is an old study. This is more than 10 years old, but it was a, it was a dramatic meta-analysis when we published it, because it shows really clearly that there is no single brain region, and later we showed no single brain pattern or network that is consistent and specific to any category of emotion. Here is evidence from intracranial measurements. This is from my colleague, Ralph Adolphs. They used depth electrodes in human patients, where while the patients were waiting for surgery, they measured amygdala, the response, electrical response of amygdala neurons when they showed patients images of threatening stimuli like spiders and so on and so forth. And what they found was that that amygdala neurons increased their firing rate 300 to 600 milliseconds after the onset of a threatening image, only when the patients were looking at the image, like attending directly, not covert attention, but specifically overt attention, and only after certain areas of cortex had already increased their firing rate. This is too slow for amygdala neurons to be key players in fear-related responses if they were actually going to keep you alive. And then there's these studies of these monozygotic twins who have almost total amygdala lesions. One sister has fear-related deficits that are very similar to the famous patient SM, who, by the way, can experience fear just under very, very narrow circumstances. But the other sister actually experienced no deficits in fear whatsoever. Now, scientists have also looked for fear circuitry beyond the amygdala. So here I'm showing you brain activation results from 3 studies in which people were experiencing fear as they had their brain scanned. Each study used supervised machine learning solutions to find the brain patterns for fear. And as you can see, each study found a different pattern. So here too, variation is the norm. And if you were expecting a single brain pattern for fear, something like a biomarker for fear, then these results might look like a failure to replicate, but they're not. This is evidence that the human brain can create fear in multiple ways, which we call multiple realizability, or sometimes we call degeneracy.
So you can train your brain to don't feel fear.
Excuse me?
You can train your brain to do not feel fear.
What I'm saying here is that what your brain does in fear, there are multiple patterns that correspond to fear, not one pattern, multiple patterns. So when you feel fear, I was actually going to skip this study, but now I'll just show it. So what your brain does in fear depends on the situation. Your brain does not do one thing in fear. It does many things in fear. Your brain has many ways to make fear, not just one pattern, many patterns. That's the point. So I was going to show you, a bunch of other studies actually to make this point, but we're running a little behind schedule. So I will skip those studies to get to the punchline.
Can people put their phones on airplane mode maybe?
So emotions appear to be complex constructions. They don't arise from simple circuits. You don't have mythical emotion circuits buried deep inside some animal part of your brain, even if it feels like that to us. Feelings are really not a guide to how the brain creates emotion or how it creates any mental event. And so I think putting these 3 lessons together, here's what I think we can say about the nature of emotion. The first thing we can say is that there is enough evidence, I think, at this point that we can claim that categories of anger and sadness and fear and so on are not natural kinds by any definition, not by a prototype definition, not by a classical definition. There's simply too much variation. And the belief that there is some core, deep similarity between that instances of a given emotion category that they share is really an example of what Ortoni and Medine called psychological essentialism. This is the belief that there's a deep abiding similarity amongst instances of a category when in fact they don't, nobody knows what it's just a belief that essence is there, even though no one can identify it. And so people keep searching for it and spending unbelievable amounts of time and millions and millions and millions of dollars for over a century looking for these core sort of deep features that define anger or define sadness or define fear and make them different from each other. Instead, I think the evidence is really clear across all domains that the business problem here is that there's variability in responding, and the variation is real. It's not random. It's structured by situations. And the really big question is how? How is the brain doing it? How is the brain creating really what looks like sameness out of variation, right? And this is what I called the emotion paradox in 2006. That, I might, smile in anger, my heart rate might increase or decrease in anger, I might cry in anger, but somehow my brain knows that these are all anger, right? I might look at another person and make inferences that they're angry, experience them as angry, despite tremendous variation in what they're doing or what they're saying. How is the brain solving this problem? And the solution to the emotion paradox, it turns out, can be found in another book by Charles Darwin. You might have heard of this book too. It gave us a tool for understanding structured variation, which is called population thinking. This was On the Origin of Species, but named really by the evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr. Population thinking is the idea that a category is a population of variable instances, and the variation is meaningful in relation to the situation that in this case, that the organism finds itself in, its niche, if you will. So variation amongst these individuals who are Olympians is real and important. This is in contrast to typological thinking, the belief in types, where the statistical summary is assumed to be real and the variation around the summary is assumed to be error. And Charles Darwin, in On the Origin of Species, is widely cited as having vanquished the belief in types, because before Darwin's book, people believed that animal categories were types with essences. And after Darwin, they no longer believe that. Some people no longer believe that. It took a little while to get rid of essentialist thinking, even in biology. But the point is that in typological thinking, you're treating variation as error and you're trying to get rid of it. You get rid of it in experiments by not even sampling it. But with population thinking, the variation is real. The summary is an abstraction or a fiction, and might not even exist in nature, right? So if I were to sum up, I would say psychology and neuroscience has been searching for emotion types for more than a century, when really what we have to be looking for is trying to understand emotion categories as populations of situated variable instances. And again, William James was ahead of his time. He actually knew this and wrote this. He said, the varieties of emotions are innumerable. The trouble with emotions in psychology is that they're regarded too much as eternal and sacred psychic entities, like the old immutable species in natural history, meaning before Darwin. And that he went on to write, but if we regard them as products of more general causes, as species, are now regarded as products of heredity and variation, the mere distinguishing and cataloging becomes of subsidiary importance. So the hypothesis about general causes that I eventually settled on is is called the theory of constructed emotion, and it's the idea that emotions are not built into your brain by endowed circuits. They are built by your brain. Instances are built by your brain using concepts that are tailored to the environment. So the hypothesis in brief, which I'll be talking about over the next couple of lectures in more detail, is that neurotypical human brains construct categories predictively as ensembles of signals. And these signals guide action in a metabolically efficient manner. And in doing so, they give meaning to the sensory signals from your body and from the world. And so, as a mental experience. And so the result is an event like an instance of emotion or another psychological category, which means that emotions are not reactions to what situations mean. They are what situations mean. The signals from the brain and from the body and from the world constrain one another, which is sometimes referred to as contextual coherence, from which new levels of organization emerge. And those new levels of organization are the mental features that we experience. So if you remember this picture of my daughter, right? What is she feeling? Well, if you're experiencing her as feeling pleasure, other than you, which you already knew, then what you're doing here is you're making a situation-specific concept for pleasure that makes these visual signals meaning to you. Pleasure. And with that, I will thank you for your attention.